There's something about rejection that cuts deeper than physical pain, deeper than disappointment, deeper than almost any other human experience. And if you've ever wondered why rejection from someone who shouldn't even matter that much can leave you questioning everything about yourself for months or even years, Carl Jung understood exactly why this happens and what it reveals about the human psyche. But here's what most people never realize about healing from rejection. The pain isn't really about the person who rejected you. It's not about what you lost or what might have been. The devastating pain of rejection is actually your unconscious mind trying to show you something crucial about yourself that you've been avoiding your entire life. Jung discovered through decades of therapeutic work that people who struggle to heal from rejection are almost always people who have never fully faced what he called the rejected parts of themselves. The external rejection triggers an internal wound that was already there, already festering, already demanding attention. And until you're willing to look at that internal rejection honestly, no amount of time, therapy, or new relationships will truly heal the pain. Today, we're going to explore one of Jung's most uncomfortable insights about human psychology. The people you can't get over, the rejections that haunt you, the relationships that ended badly and still occupy space in your mind. These aren't just random, painful experiences. They're mirrors reflecting back the parts of yourself you've been unconsciously rejecting for years. What I'm about to share with you will be difficult to hear because it requires taking responsibility for psychological patterns you probably didn't even know you had. But it's also liberating because once you understand what rejection is really showing you about yourself, you can heal it at the source instead of just managing the symptoms. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." But what he also discovered was that everything that devastates us about being rejected by others is usually pointing towards something we've been rejecting about ourselves. And until you're willing to face this internal rejection, external rejections will continue to trigger the same devastating psychological response. If you want to understand the deeper psychological dynamics that keep you trapped in cycles of painful rejection and learn how to heal these patterns at their source, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We explore the Jungian insights that can transform your relationship with yourself and others. The truth about rejection that most people spend their entire lives avoiding is this: you can't be truly devastated by someone rejecting something about you that you fully accept about yourself. The pain comes from them rejecting something you were already secretly afraid was true, something you've been trying to hide, something you haven't learned to love or accept in yourself. This is why healing rejection requires courage most people never develop. The courage to look honestly at what the rejection revealed about your own relationship with yourself. First insight. Jung understood that devastating rejection always triggers what he called the core wound of self-abandonment, the realization that you've been rejecting essential parts of yourself in hopes of being acceptable to others. When someone rejects you, the pain isn't just about losing them. It's about recognizing how much of yourself you abandoned in trying to keep them. Think about the last rejection that really devastated you. Not just disappointed you or made you sad, but left you questioning your worth, replaying conversations, analyzing every detail, wondering what was wrong with you. Jung would ask you to look deeper than the surface story about what happened and examine what parts of yourself you were hiding, minimizing, or changing in that relationship. Were you pretending to be more easygoing than you actually are? Were you downplaying your intelligence so they wouldn't feel threatened? Were you acting more social and outgoing than felt natural? Were you suppressing your emotional needs, your creative interests, your spiritual beliefs, your political views, your personal boundaries? The devastating pain of rejection often comes from the unconscious recognition that you lost yourself in trying to be what you thought they wanted, and they rejected you anyway. This creates a double wound: the pain of being rejected, and the deeper pain of realizing you rejected yourself first. Jung observed that people who heal most completely from rejection are those who use the experience to recognize how they've been abandoning themselves and make the commitment to never do it again. They realized that the rejection wasn't really about their inadequacy. It was about the impossibility of maintaining authentic connection while hiding essential parts of who they are. The person who was trying to be less sensitive, less intense, less complicated, less demanding, gets rejected and realizes they've been rejecting their own sensitivity, intensity, complexity, and needs. The healing comes not from trying to become more acceptable to others, but from learning to accept these rejected parts of themselves so completely that external acceptance becomes irrelevant. Second insight: Jung discovered that people who can't heal from rejection are usually trapped in what he called the fantasy of conditional love, the unconscious belief that if they can just be good enough, perfect enough, or acceptable enough, they can earn unconditional acceptance from others. But this fantasy prevents them from developing the only thing that actually heals rejection: unconditional acceptance of themselves. The fantasy of conditional love keeps you focused on what you need to change about yourself to be more acceptable rather than learning to accept yourself as you are. It keeps you analyzing what went wrong, what you could have done differently, how you might fix yourself to avoid future rejection. But Jung understood that this approach actually perpetuates the cycle of painful rejection because it reinforces the core belief that your worth depends on other people's approval. Here's the uncomfortable truth that most people avoid: the people who rejected you might have been completely right about the incompatibility, and it still doesn't mean anything about your worth. You might be too intense for some people, too quiet for others, too ambitious for some, not ambitious enough for others. These aren't character flaws to be fixed. They're aspects of your authentic self that make you compatible with some people and incompatible with others. The healing comes from recognizing that compatibility isn't about being universally acceptable. It's about being authentically yourself and finding people who appreciate rather than tolerate your authentic expression. But this requires giving up the fantasy that you can be loved by everyone if you just perfect yourself enough. Jung worked with many patients who had spent decades trying to become worthy of love from people who were fundamentally incompatible with their authentic nature. The healing came not from becoming more acceptable, but from recognizing that their attempts to earn conditional love were preventing them from recognizing and accepting the unconditional love that was available from people who actually appreciated their authentic self. The person trapped in conditional love fantasies keeps trying to fix themselves after rejection. The person who has learned unconditional self-acceptance recognizes rejection as information about compatibility rather than commentary on their worth. Third insight: Jung recognized that unhealed rejection often stems from what he called projection of the inner critic onto others, the tendency to assume that other people's rejection confirms the harsh judgments you've been making about yourself unconsciously. When someone rejects you, you don't just feel the pain of their rejection. You feel the pain of every cruel thing you've ever thought about yourself, as if their rejection proves that your inner critic was right all along. This is why some rejections feel so catastrophically devastating, while others feel manageable. It's not really about how much you cared about the person or how invested you were in the relationship. It's about whether their rejection triggered your core areas of self-criticism and shame. If you've been unconsciously believing you're too needy, too emotional, too demanding, then rejection that seems to confirm these beliefs will be devastating. If you've been secretly afraid you're boring, unintelligent, or physically unattractive, then rejection that appears to validate these fears will trigger intense psychological pain. But Jung understood that this pain is actually an opportunity for profound healing if you're willing to use it consciously. Instead of taking the rejection as confirmation that your self-criticism is accurate, you can use it to become aware of the harsh judgments you've been making about yourself and begin the process of healing your relationship with these rejected aspects of your personality. The healing comes from recognizing that your inner critic isn't telling you the truth about your worth. It's just pointing toward parts of yourself that need acceptance and integration rather than judgment and rejection. When you learn to treat yourself with the same compassion you would show a good friend, external rejection loses its power to devastate you because it can't trigger self-hatred that's no longer there. Jung observed that people who have healed their relationship with their inner critic experience rejection very differently. Instead of feeling confirmed in their worst fears about themselves, they feel curious about the compatibility issues that led to the rejection and grateful for the clarity about whether this was the right relationship for them. Fourth insight. Jung understood that painful rejection often reveals what he called the false self's attachment to external validation, the recognition that you've been trying to get from others what you can only give to yourself. When rejection devastates you, it's usually because you were unconsciously depending on that person's acceptance to provide something essential that you haven't learned to provide for yourself. Maybe you were depending on their admiration to feel valuable, their attention to feel worthy, their affection to feel lovable, their commitment to feel secure, their approval to feel acceptable. When they withdrew these things through rejection, you didn't just lose their validation. You lost access to feelings about yourself that you had unknowingly outsourced to them. This is why healing rejection requires what Jung called the development of internal validation structures, learning to provide for yourself what you were trying to get from others. You need to develop your own sense of worth that doesn't depend on external confirmation, your own source of security that doesn't require someone else's commitment, your own feeling of being lovable that doesn't need constant external proof. The uncomfortable truth is that if someone else's rejection can devastate your sense of self-worth, then your sense of self-worth was never really stable to begin with. It was dependent on external validation, which means it was always vulnerable to being withdrawn by others. Jung worked with many patients who discovered that their most painful rejections had forced them to develop internal resources they never would have cultivated otherwise. They learned to validate themselves, to appreciate their own company, to find meaning and purpose that didn't depend on romantic partnership, to feel complete as individuals rather than feeling like half of a couple seeking completion. The healing from rejection becomes complete when you can honestly say that while you would enjoy being chosen by someone compatible, you don't need to be chosen to feel valuable, worthy, or complete. This isn't emotional detachment or defensive independence. It's psychological wholeness that makes healthy relationships possible because you're no longer trying to use others to fix what's broken in your relationship with yourself. Fifth insight. Jung discovered that the people who heal most completely from rejection are those who learn to see it as what he called individuation catalyst, a painful but necessary experience that forces them to develop aspects of themselves they never would have accessed while seeking external validation. Rejection becomes the doorway to discovering who you really are underneath all the adaptations you made trying to be acceptable to others. When you're no longer trying to be chosen by someone specific, you have the freedom to discover what you actually want, need, value, and enjoy, rather than what you think will make you attractive to others. When you're no longer performing acceptability, you can explore aspects of your personality, creativity, spirituality, and lifestyle that you might have suppressed while trying to fit into someone else's preferences. Jung observed that many of his patients' most authentic and fulfilling life directions emerged only after devastating rejections, Force them to stop trying to live according to other people's expectations and start living according to their own authentic impulses. The person who always adapted their interests to match their partner's discovers what they're actually passionate about. The person who minimized their intelligence to avoid threatening others learns to celebrate their mental gifts. The person who suppressed their emotional sensitivity to appear more stable learns to honor their empathic nature as a strength rather than a liability. This process of post-rejection self-discovery often leads to what Jung called authentic individuation, becoming genuinely yourself rather than a collection of adaptations designed to earn approval. And ironically, this authenticity makes you far more attractive to compatible people than any amount of strategic self-modification ever could. The healing is complete when you can look back at the rejection that once devastated you and feel genuine gratitude for how it forced you to stop abandoning yourself and start embracing who you really are. Not gratitude for the pain, but gratitude for the growth that the pain made possible. And here we reach Jung's most profound insight about healing rejection. The goal isn't to become immune to rejection or to avoid situations where rejection is possible. The goal is to develop such a complete and loving relationship with yourself that external rejection becomes information rather than devastation, feedback rather than condemnation, redirection rather than destruction. Jung understood that rejection is actually one of the most powerful tools for psychological development if you're willing to use it consciously. Every painful rejection contains information about where you've been abandoning yourself, what parts of your authentic nature you've been hiding, and what aspects of your relationship with yourself need healing. The person who has truly healed rejection doesn't become cold, defensive, or unavailable. They become more authentic, more selective, and more confident in their own worth. They stop trying to earn love through performance and start offering love through genuine connection. They stop seeking completion through others and start creating relationships from wholeness. This is what Jung called psychological sovereignty, the ability to engage in relationships from choice rather than need, to offer your authentic self rather than a carefully curated version designed for approval, to experience rejection as incompatibility rather than inadequacy. The uncomfortable truth about healing rejection is that it requires facing everything about yourself that you've been trying to hide, fix, or change to be more acceptable to others. It requires developing the courage to be authentically yourself, even when that authenticity makes you incompatible with some people. But this courage leads to something far more valuable than universal acceptance. It leads to genuine connection with people who appreciate your authentic self. And more importantly, it leads to a relationship with yourself that no external rejection can destroy. The next time you experience rejection that triggers deep pain, remember Jung's insight. The pain isn't really about what you lost. It's about what you need to find within yourself. The rejection isn't evidence of your inadequacy. It's an opportunity to discover which parts of yourself you've been rejecting and finally learn to embrace them completely. This is the only path to healing rejection that actually works. Not trying to become more acceptable to others, but learning to accept yourself so completely that other people's approval becomes nice to have rather than necessary to survive.